Okay, so good evening. Tonight I will be talking to you about, it's a book presentation. The book is actually there. I will be giving a presentation about my dissertation that now has become a book. The book is titled Blind Maps and Blue Dots. And what we will do today, we will talk about, let's see if I find the right button. Oh. Yeah, I will give a kind of a lecture of 45 minutes, then we have a short break. And then I will be joined by Gert Staal, who's a writer, critic, and editor, but he's also has been one of my supervisors of my PhD research. And we will be talking a bit more, and we will also, if you have any questions, we will have reserve some time there to answer them. You can ask them in the chat, or just indicate in the chat that you want to ask a question, and then we will get back to you later. So this evening is a so-called ARC session, which is an initiative of the ACPA, of Academy of Creative and Performing Arts of Leiden University and University of the Arts The Hague. And this is, we are going to talk about artistic research. And we want to, and I think the next sentence is very important. This is a space of exchange, and I would really, so it's not only of just me talking, but also discussing with the audience. So feel free to engage later on. So ACPA offers 2 doctoral programs, Doc Artes, which is a doctoral program in musical arts, and PhD, which is a doctoral program in art and design. And my PhD research, that was kind of the basis for the book that I will talk about today, was in fact done at PhD with Professor Janneke Wesseling was my promoter, and Gert Staal, that I already mentioned, and Lucas Evers were the co-promoters. This is the kind of ambitious timeline for tonight. This is my kind of table of contents. I will talk a bit about my practice, then I will address kind of the starting point for the research, the research question. I will look at graphic design, which is my field. I'm a graphic designer. Then I would look at why I took cartography as a kind of laboratory to look at graphic design, and I will look at to go into 2 case studies, a bit more extensive, and I will finish up by talking about the book as a discursive and artistic format. The book as a kind of product of artistic research, as a kind of both as a kind of artistic way, artistic format for artistic research, and also as a discursive format. Okay, so just briefly about myself, just that you know, that you can situate me a bit. I have a design practice, a studio in Amsterdam, and I have where we do books and maps mostly. I am currently, I'm not only an alumnus of ACPA, but also a kind of currently a assistant professor at PhD. I'm head of a master in Eindhoven. I have 2 smaller teaching positions in Urbino and Copenhagen, and I'm also a researcher at ACPA. So my practice, this is what we do. Basically, we make books and we make maps. And here are 2 examples of that. So the research question, which is I think it's a very important issue, always been in the kind of in our during our kind of our conversations in PhD. PhD is a program that you're together with other peers. You're doing your individual research, but from every 6 weeks you come together and we share where we are, and then and the research question is always a kind of a key thing there. And what we engage in is artistic research. And I give you here, if I have to explain what artistic research is, I give you my kind of my 20-second kind of definition. and that is understanding the world by means of practice, and understanding practice by means of the world. And hopefully that becomes clearer later what I want to mean, but it means that there is a kind of it's research in and through the arts in using your practice. So my research question is this one. What can a post-representational reading of contemporary map-making practices reveal about the blurring of the producer-user divide in graphic design? And I can understand that it's complete, doesn't make sense to you at all. So I'm going to unpack that a bit. And basically, when I started, this was kind of what I was concerned with. What's happening in my field? And my field is then graphic design. So what we've seen in the last 20, 30 years is that the digitization of tools to record, create, edit, produce, and distribute visual information triggered a fundamental transformation of graphic design. And to me, the crux of this change is that the distinction between the different roles in the process of this creation, editing, production, and use is disappearing. And I use cartography as a kind of laboratory. I think that's what I said before. And that is something I had experience with making maps. And intuitively, by making maps, I felt that what was happening in graphic design was also happening in map making, but maybe in an amplified way. So that made it kind of, and it made it easier to study the changes of graphic design. And what I also found out, which was kind of very beneficial for my research, is that it's a kind of transformation that's much more theorized than the one in graphic design. And I used the approach of post-representational cartography, which I will talk about more later, to look at certain case studies, to certain kind of and the case studies of non-specialist map makers, because I think one of the changes that's happening in the broader field of the production of visual information is that it's no longer a kind of specialist field. People who have access to the tools basically can produce it. And I was very interested in that kind of new group. And I used them as a kind of case study to do further research. That was kind of my, so what I just said is that my field of research is graphic design, and what I'm looking at is the changes in the field, which is this disappearing distinction. My method is post-representational cartography, and my research object, what I'm studying, is this contemporary map-making practices. And then this together results in this research question. Okay, graphic design. And one of the things that I researched in my kind of part of my research, it was to look at graphic design histories, to look at kind of descriptions of the field, to try to understand if what's happening right now, if I could date it back to what happened before. What I took 5 popular complete graphic design history, so it's not related to a kind of single country or a very specific period of time, but the general kind of design histories. And I started to quantify these kind of descriptions. So what you see here are the 5 books. And what I did, I just made some timelines of those kind of graphic design histories. If I say I mean we, and if I say we, I mean I did this with my studio, in my studio, and I will talk more about that later. What you see here is a kind of comparison of those kind of 5 history books, and you see that there's a they're very different. So the starting point is very different from all 5 of them. They have different densities of information. What I did here is I put for every page in the book, there's 1 line. So if you see a very dense area with many lines together, then it becomes more dark, it becomes dark gray or black. Then there's many pages dedicated to that specific period. It was interesting because it gave me the freedom later on to think, well, then I can think of my own description of graphic design history. So I did also some other tests. So we looked at designers who appeared in more than one of those kind of graphic design history books. Mostly men, mostly white men, mostly Western white men. And we also looked at the kind of the products with which they were kind of appearing in those kind of books. And it's the traditional graphic design output. I encountered at the time a very interesting text by Andrew Blauvelt, who's a kind of American graphic designer and curator and currently museum director, who kind of made a kind of division of the history of graphic design, and he kind of centered it around the tools to produce graphic design. So the tools to produce, distribute, edit graphic design. And he says there are kind of basically 3 phases: pre-production, production, and production, where pre-production is actually the history of graphic design until the digital age, where kind of the graphic designer was a kind of specialist in the kind of the information chain, in the whole process of producing visual information, one of many. And with the computer, the graphic designer had access to the whole production process. So that focus shifted in the post-production period, which is actually the period where we're in right now. There is another shift happening where the designer is no longer the sole creator, but it's together with others. So it's more that the designer is becoming the post-producer rather than the producer. I looked at that and I made a kind of different kind of time, which is kind of partly based on Blauvelt, which looks at kind of the characteristics of those kind of tools, mechanization, digitization, and dissemination. And I think I should show the next image because then you can see it a bit. And here you see them. So what we did is we wrote down of two books all the kind of technologies that are kind of listed that deal with kind of graphic design, with the kind of production, editing, distributing, everything. And we kind of listed them per kind of their type. So mechanization is everything to do with the industrialization of graphic design. Digitization has everything to do where the graphic designer becomes the producer herself. And dissemination is this kind of new internet-based, Web 2.0 based kind of technologies that where kind of the designer, the role of the designer dissolves, you could say. So I think my practice is positioned between those two lines, the digitization and dissemination, between the technologies that made my work possible and between the technology that kind of threatened to make my role obsolete. You see a detail. And here we have kind of the books that I've presented earlier, reorganized per page length. If we look at those kind of 4 periods of time, so that's for 2, 3, and 4 are mechanization, digitization, and dissemination, and the first one is like the pre-industrial age. And you see that there's only a very limited amount of pages spent on the current age. So as I said, I have a kind of practice where we kind of make maps, we design many maps, and I felt that building on the experiences from my practice, I saw that there were kind of similarities between graphic design and map making, but I noticed that what's happening in map making was more extreme almost, because it was a more closed off field than graphic design. It was only people who were, only the state or very powerful publishing houses were making maps. So when with the new digital tools came to make maps yourself, that was a bigger revolution. So the impact was bigger. That's why it became an interesting kind of laboratory to look at transformation. And I also found some really interesting kind of theories about cartography that were that I could adopt and use to look at the practices that I was studying. So, for instance, Rob Kitchen, who wrote a text about, who gave a lecture about different ways of thinking about maps. He made this model. It's again a kind of 3-step model: representational cartography, more than representational cartography, and post-representational cartography. And he argued that representational cartography is a field that came into being after the Second World War, and the thinking about maps developed. The focus was kind of the map as a kind of functional object, and its premise was that the world can be objectively known and truthfully mapped. Later on in the at the end of the 80s, different ways of ideas from post-structuralist thinking and actor network theory resulted in a shift in the thinking about maps, and it has been called critical cartography or modern representational cartography, where maps are not only seen as products of power, but also instruments for producing power. Map making is not neutral or objective, but it's kind of laden with power. It deals with creating knowledge rather than revealing it. So that's kind of a very substantial shift in the thinking compared to that representational cartography. Post-representational cartography is a kind of it's a kind of more recent kind of mode of thinking. It's the term coined by British American geographer John Pickles, and it looks at the full scope of the map creation and production, including the role of the user. According to post-representational cartography, a map is never fully formed. It is constantly being produced and reproduced every time a user engages with it. So it's kind of more, it approaches the map as a process rather than as a product. So I understand, and I see the kind of similarities and the symmetry between these kind of 3 models, these 2 models, the Kitchen and the Blauvelt model. And that's something that I was quite happy to discover that. So with this in mind, I looked at 2 case studies. In total, there are 3 case studies. So I show you the first and the third case studies of map making practices by technology companies and of amateurs. So the first one that I want to look at is the blue dot. You probably all know it. It's Google Maps with the blue dot. It's the location software. The location, it's a symbol that kind of indicates where you are on the map. And what I did in this case study, I looked at Google Maps, Google Earth, Google Maps specifically, using these kind of 3 ways of thinking. So first, I looked at it as a kind of as a functional object, and what I found out is that Google Maps doesn't have a legend, doesn't have a map key. It's not possible to find out what everything means. So we spent time at the studio trying to discover that and try to pin the colors down and try to develop the legend of Google Maps. And it's much more difficult than you think, because Google Maps is not a kind of consistent map. It has different kind of zoom levels. So here you see the kind of the same color values, and then in vertical direction you see the different zoom levels. So in horizontal you see the different categories, and in the vertical you see the kind of the zoom levels. So at the bottom you see the most zoomed out position at Google Maps. So that's the one that's the globe, and the top is the most zoomed in you're on a street level. And what you see here is that there is much more information shown on the map on closer zoom levels than when you're farther away. And that kind of results in a kind of a map that consists of two layers. There's a kind of base map, that's a background map, which is in very pale colors. This is again the same thing as I showed before. So it's in vertical direction is the different zoom levels, and horizontal direction you see the different kind of categories. And on top of that base map, you have a kind of whole system of pins and dots and lines that indicate different kind of commercial functions, cities, borders, countries, names. And this is actually the Google Maps palette. So we also looked at Jacques Bertin, who's a French cartographer, researcher, educator, who also has made his kind of his own theory about the semiology of graphics. So it's the 1967. So it's related to Roland Barthes. It's looking at the graphic as a kind of language almost. And with this Jurian Schrover cover, very beautiful. And the theory of Bertin says that there is a map or information visualization has a certain kind of content, what we call the information, and it has a kind of graphic container, which is the graphic system. And there should be a kind of relationship between the two. And if you make the relationship clear, then it's a kind of it's a functional map. So if one has three elements, the other one should all have that as well. And then he says there are kind of three graphic marks, point, line, and area. And then there's kind of visual variables, or different kind of ways to differentiate and to create kind of show the different kinds of information in the system. So here is a kind of illustration that kind of summarizes that kind of system. So we see from if we go from top with the clock, so we see the T, taille, size, the value, the grain, the raster. We see color, we see orientation, we see form, and in the middle we see position. This is kind of these are kind of the visual variables, and with those, if you know those, you can make information visualization. And most of Bertin's work is about testing this out with user testing. So he makes these kind of references, or he says you should do one, or you should do two, but you should never mix. It's very written with the finger. You should not do this. And it's interesting that if you read it carefully and you compare it to kind of contemporary practices, you see that it's very based on practical considerations. Bertin is not a big fan of color, for instance, and he has several reasons for it. And one of them is that color is too expensive. And that is, of course, that might be true in 1967 when you're producing printed matter, but nowadays, if you make a map on screen, that's not a kind of argument anymore. Another argument he has, and that's kind of what you see here with kind of the crossed out categories, is that it says certain colors have a different optical weight than others. For instance, yellow is much lighter than magenta. So you cannot use color for line, according to Bertin. Okay, so what I did is I used Bertin's system to look at the colors of Google Maps and to see what the kind of the visual variables were. And you see that they're very limited, that they don't make use of the full kind of potential of what you can do as a kind of designer. And so the map is extremely pale. So it's almost like the memory of a map, and not a kind of a memory of something that we know, that we have seen before. So if we look at Google Maps from a kind of critical point of view, then whole other kind of considerations come into play. For instance, there is the issue of projection. The Mercator projection, for instance, is one that is kind of connected to kind of colonialism. It's one of the medieval seafarers. People, it's kind of the sea maps that were made to go out to the east. They used Mercator, and that was kind of the same projection that Google initially adopted, and now it only has it on certain kind of zoom levels. Google is also, it also depends on what you see is from where you look at it. So there are certain kind of disputed territories. Depending on where you access the map, you see something else. You see whether it's kind of a dotted line, which is kind of contested, or whether it's a solid line, uncontested. Or at one point, Google Maps changed the number of information it showed for kind of that it was favoring mobile devices over desktop use, which made areas look much emptier. Or a lot of the software that was kind of the basis for Google Earth and later Google Maps was kind of funded by the CIA. So you're looking at basically using a military technology, and it's also Google Earth is also used by the state to spy on us. So there are all these kind of power games at play in using Google Maps, both in the technology behind it, but also in the design of Google Maps. Here you see a timeline of kind of satellite navigation systems. For instance, GPS is the one that we all know. So it's a timeline starts in 1978 until today, and every horizontal line represents one satellite. So the more satellites that are available, the more precise a signal these kind of navigation and the networks give out. And this kind of was originally kind of sparked, it's kind of originally kind of set up as a kind of military technology that became then later sparked a whole technology industry. Yeah, so what you see here is the different kind of devices that use GPS. So from the top to the bottom, we have military GPS receivers, which were very huge, expensive devices. Then custom GPS receivers for handheld use, for hiking, or for car use to navigate. And then as a kind of additional feature in smart devices like smartphones and smart watches. So there's also this kind of, there's this military and economic power going on when we talk about satellite technology, navigation technology, and Google Maps is part of that. And here I literally dissected these kind of things to see what kind of the GPS antenna was of a regular smartphone. There's also kind of, you could say that also the design of the map also contributes to that kind of power game. So it's not only the technologies behind it, but also the design itself. You could say that the kind of the graphic language of the map is what has been called the rhetoric of neutrality. So it's kind of it's a language, visual language that appears to be neutral, but in fact is not. And Joanna Drucker, she has called maps Trojan horses from the empirical sciences, that we they appear to be kind of a presentation, but they are in fact interpretations of the facts. They are arguments made in graphical form. So I also looked at the Google Maps in terms of the post-representational cartography. So that is also seeing the map as a kind of process, as a processual map. And that's a kind of, wait, I have to get the right quote here. What is being argued that kind of that post-representational cartography, it questions kind of they say that in previous kind of ways of thinking, the maps were about it was kind of ontological, and the post-representation is ontogenic. So ontological refers to how things are, ontogenic to how things become, and that's been described that until post-representational cartography, so even in critical cartography or in representational cartography, the maps had a kind of ontological secure foundation. That is that a map is a map and it is constant. But in post-representational cartography, the fundamental question of cartography is ontogenic. And maps are constantly shifting, developing, evolving. So it's never complete. So making and using are not consecutive stages of a map, but they're kind of parallel processes. A map is in a constant state of becoming. And to me, Google Maps is a processual map. And that has to do, for me, you see that, for instance, in the blue dot. And the blue dot is a kind of location technology that kind of comes from that technology that comes from kind of in-flight kind of navigation systems to later it's a combination of imaging technologies and kind of fast networks that resulted in this kind of blue dot that indicates where you are. And the blue dot, I was really curious to find out who made the blue dot, and it is in fact it's this guy. It's Sanjay Mavenkar, who is not a kind of designer, but he is a kind of software developer, a software engineer. Here is his LinkedIn page, and at the time he worked at Google, and he's not trained as a graphic designer, although he was kind of when he was working at Google, he was kind of an experienced design manager. That's also the future of design. That word design has been kind of adopted by many fields outside design. And his training is at Harvard. He studied computer science at Harvard. And you might know him because he was one of the first. He was this is a film still from the Social Network, where it's about the genesis of Facebook. What we see here is two people who are trying to try to make a kind of software called the Harvard Connection. They try to involve Mark Zuckerberg, who was maybe inspired by that idea and created his own software social network called Facebook, the Facebook. But the original designer for the Harvard Connection was, in fact, Sanjay Mavenkar, the designer of the blue dot. Okay. I like the design of the blue dot. I think it's very clever design. It works. I think I like this circle. It makes sense. But I don't completely understand why it is the same throughout. So why this is an abstracted map of the same site on various zoom levels, and you see that the blue dot remains the same wherever you are. It's the only element in the map that kind of remains the same. Many other things change color or change appearance, but the blue dot doesn't. Over time, the blue dot changed, however, but that had to do more with the kind of the resolution of the phone screens. It became much more round. It was very pixelated because we had kind of more crude screens, and now it became more perfect. Okay, I see that's already quite late, so I'm going to speed up a bit. It's another case study, the situation in Syria, which is a map by a teenager, a series of maps of the Syria conflict. I want to first maybe talk about the difference between map making and mapping. And it may be interesting to look at this quote by a Spanish cartographer who in the 18th century made a kind of map of Spain. And he said the best way to go somewhere is to walk there and measure it. But that's not always possible. So he was one of the users of the kind of a desk mapping method where he used other people to make recordings, and he then interpreted them and made them into a map. And so there are kind of two things. There's kind of there's mapping. That's looking at a site and collecting data, and then transforming that data into an image, into a map. Thomas van Lingen, who was an Amsterdam teenager when he first published his map, which is called The Situation in Syria. He was map maker. So he used information he found on social media, photographs, videos, other posts that he kind of combined, sometimes thousands of them, to make a very accurate map of the Syria conflict. In fact, it was so precise that it was kind of adopted by international news media as the map of Syria. And it was especially at the time when ISIS became the rise of ISIS that this map became, we were really in need of something concrete information, because we were so uncertain about, insecure about what's happening with what ISIS was doing. So this was one of his first maps, and it's interesting. And then for a few years, he made every 2 weeks he made a new map. And it's really interesting to check how that kind of developed. So, and also how, as a kind of map maker, how he learned things, how he adapted things. So he introduced a second color or lighter shade of the color to indicate areas that were kind of less densely populated, or how he changed names. So he Rojava, that became then Federation Forces. And what you see here is a kind of timeline of the legend of his maps. So what we did, we measured, so the surface areas of those different maps, and then we kind of translated it. And this is a timeline from 2014 when he made his first map to mid 2018 when he made his last one, or September 2018. And you see that there are quite regular kind of intervals. And what you see, the large light gray bit is the Islamic State land that was kind of ruled by the Islamic State, and because it's kind of lighter shaded, it's lowly, the low density, not really inhabited by many people. So I looked at the changes of the legend. When did he change things, and what did they mean? Sometimes it was kind of based on content, sometimes it was based on new graphic insights. We looked at kind of because it's social media, how much response he got, how much. So here you see all the kind of the tweets, the retweets, and the replies. And you see that there are as many around, let's say, late 2014 to end of 2016. That's kind of a very active period where many people responded, and it ebbs away a bit. And it's exactly around the time when ISIS was the rise of ISIS. When he became very kind of, people started to follow him more and started to kind of interact with his kind of work. And we did the same for the kind of the news items that were published about his work. So you see the titles of the newspaper and magazine articles and news items about his maps and in their original language. And you see also that that coincides with the rise of ISIS. So the fame of Thomas Verlenge is ironically connected to the amount of territory that kind of ISIS kind of was controlling. What I find interesting about his practice is that he kind of did it not using kind of commercial design software. He used a kind of very simple laptop and a smartphone and Microsoft Paint. And we made a kind of comparison between Microsoft Paint and existing design software to show the unsophisticatedness of this Microsoft Paint comparing to other design software. And what I like about it is that he created a new kind of design practice that's kind of outside of all the kind of commercial and existing educational structures. Here, for instance, you see a list of design schools and the kind of software that they teach. And the pink shade software at the top are kind of all the Adobe software that you have to buy licenses for that only are so expensive that it only allows for kind of specialized practice, which is not kind of interesting if you want to make a map once every 2 weeks. So I think more than I admire Thomas as a kind of map maker who made a very accurate map, I admire that he kind of invented a new model of practice. Okay, the last bit that I want to talk about is about the book, this book. And the book as a kind of format for artistic research, as a kind of both one that kind of documents this discursive, kind of the theoretical, the textual side, and as a kind of artistic information carrier. And then I have to talk about language. Language was one of the things that I discovered during my research. It was quite a crucial aspect in the development of a field. Language in the sense of jargon, which acts as a way of gatekeeping, of people keeping peoples out by adopting a very specialist language that are kind of that people from outside cannot access. But also jargon that kind of is a kind of obstruction in transdisciplinary conversations, because we all have our kind of own meaning that we kind of attach to certain kind of words. And that made me conclude that if we want to have a kind of expanded understanding of a field, then we need to address the languages used to describe it. And that a singular language does not suffice if we talk about if we want to get to go beyond our kind of the boundaries of our field. And with languages, I mean textual and visual. And that's why my dissertation consists for half of the part out of text, but the other half consists of visualizations that I showed you tonight. Visualization that I kind of developed in my studio with my people working here with me. I'm blessed that I have a large team, and we kind of did many kind of experiments, and also became part of the conversation in the studio that way. But we did have many kind of visualizations, and that they're kind of and the book alternates them. So 2 pages of text, 2 pages of visualization, so that they're completely equal. And here you see a video of the book where you see that kind of alternating text, image, text, image, text visualization. And I deliberately used a paper that has a kind of translucency. So if you're looking at the text, you always see the kind of the visualization, and if you look at the visualization, you see the text. So that kind of the opacity of the paper was kind of used as a kind of way to combine the discursive and connect the discursive with kind of the artistic. In artistic research, there's always kind of 2 outputs. there's a kind of artistic output and a kind of discursive output, and I try to combine them. So for me, they're kind of they're combined in one single thing, which is a book, which is the book that we now kind of developed further on into this book, which is commercially available from later this in a few weeks' time. It's available. So maybe I want to end up with this kind of statement, which was one of my propositions at my kind of defense, where I kind of define artistic research as a type of investigation that establishes a discursive artistic practice that is ever evolving and in which practice and theory are fully entangled. The development of alternative and complementary modes of communication is an essential aspect of artistic research. And to maybe go a bit deeper in that. So it's a kind of it's a developing practice. It is both discursive and artistic, which is both kind of it combines these two, and these two are kind of practice and theory are fully entangled, and that entanglement is what I try to kind of materialize to putting them on either side of the paper, and using the opacity of the paper to really connect the two. And this kind of visualization also has another kind of purpose, that is that they are each a kind of different kind of rendering of the same thing. So they are each a different kind of translation of the same research. Okay, so I want to thank some people. Those are the people who helped me making the book. Some of them are here. I saw in the when we started this session. Thank you and welcome. I designed the book with Dimitri and Megan, Salome, Julie, Clémence, Dimitri, Silke, Julia, Raphael, Laura, Simon, Carina, Stella, Linda, and Denise helped me. Thank you all. And now I'm gonna, yeah, and it's available soon. Okay, thank you very much.
Would you say being involved in the PhD Arts program and working on your dissertation has actually brought in a new perspective that you also translate within your own studio and within your teaching practice?
I think they all influence each other. Thank God, luckily, because I think that's kind of that's the whole thing of doing all these things together, is not to really benefit from it. So I benefit being a researcher by being a practitioner, by being something who's practically making things, and I benefit being a researcher by asking questions to students, because asking a question to the students is asking a question to yourself. So I think all these kind of different roles, they are really they help each other. And
would you say that there was one that really benefited more than the others, or isn't that true?
Well, the thing is, when I started doing this PhD Arts program, I felt very insecure about certain aspects, the writing, about doing the research, to be part of a university. What I could rely on my confidence as a designer that I had built up, and that took me a long time to build that up, kind of that confidence. But I knew what a book was, or what a map was, and I could always go back there. So it's kind of what I noticed was that kind of not coming empty-handed, and bringing also not only the suitcase, but bringing some kind of experiences that helped me there.
Yeah, so there wasn't. It's not an easy job to mingle all these three things. You didn't talk about it that much, but I've seen from very close how difficult it was to keep up all these different trajectories, both in school and in your own practice, and doing PhD preparations, writing, presentations. What? How did you keep a grip on that combined process?
Yeah. Well, not sleeping a lot helps. When you have many hours to think about it, so I can really.
That's actually what you did.
Yeah. I think I really make the being insomniac very productive. In my case, I made the most of it. But without kidding, how I did it was just to very clearly make divisions of when to do what. So just to steadily working on it or on fixed days in the week, and yeah. But
and making deadlines.
And making deadlines, yeah.
Yeah.
I love deadlines.
That was clear because I don't remember you missing one, which I've never experienced in my whole life, to be honest. Let's talk a little bit about the hypothesis that you presented just some minutes ago. I remember you going through all kinds of permutations of that hypothesis.
Yeah.
What was the tricky thing for you to come up with a solid question or a solid statement that you wanted to investigate?
Well, I understand. It is a lot of editing involved in trying to come to a kind of statement and to really constantly trying to reformulate and to re-question and it was a kind of ping pong between the question or the statement and the individual parts. And what I try to do in the beginning, or sometimes that I just look at the different parts of it and trying what the role of each part was in the question or in the statement, investigating it and turning it around and trying to replace it with a different word. That was what I did. It was never trying to be too static, but just constantly going back and forth. That helped me. Yeah.
Which also showed how important language actually was in your whole investigation.
Yeah, that was really the biggest discovery of the whole process. That language that was for me scary at first. I'm now a bit more confident there, but also see what the power is, and also and see that you can be as kind of you can use the same strategies from your creative practice you can apply to language as well. And yeah.
One of the smaller finds that you had in connection to language was your choice to embrace ambiguity as a tool within your design practice and also within the dissertation itself. Could you explain how that works within graphic design? Because you mentioned this not during tonight's lecture, but during this morning's lecture to the students.
Yes. Yeah.
You talked about graphic design being about simplification always, making things simple. You choose a completely different perspective on that. Could you explain why?
Well, I think we all saw what happened last week, Wednesday, in Washington, D.C. I think that's kind of that you see what kind of simplicity can lead to. It's a very dangerous thing. So what I noticed that there were several parallel things going on. That kind of realization that we all have as kind of as news readers and viewers of news, that we see kind of what's happening, and that you kind of start questioning kind of the simplicity of commercial messages, of political messages. You, as a kind of designer, experiencing how easy it is to manipulate, by making things simple, making things appear truthful or neutral. and then intuitively say, I think that I have to make my users, readers aware that they're being manipulated. And then reading about it and finding words for what you intuitively sensed. And then when you intuitively, you combine those kind of words and a kind of that the thing that you intuitively found, you can make it into a strategy. You can make it into a kind of concept that you can use beyond the things that you use, and you can really actively apply it. And that basically is try to deliberately distort things by using different colors, by different shapes, by questioning perceptions, using perception and questioning them. And that's what I try to do if the project allows for it.
What does that demand for someone who looks at your work, uses your work, tries to be involved in the work?
Yeah, well, you have to find that kind of balance there, and so it also, funnily enough, leads to a kind of the ambition to be hyper simple, but not in a kind of. So, for instance, now with the book, you have the two kind of pages, page types. How can you make a text page that looks like a text page, and that you know that breathes like it? It's all about reading, which is about margins, which is about how many characters fits on a line, the size, the weight of the object. There's very, very basic kind of design thing. So you actually, if you then think of this kind of because you can be critical. That's kind of it's very easy to be critical, but if you want to do something with it, to go beyond critical, you have to go 2 steps back. You have to go back to almost like a very classic understanding of what design is, so that you can have a kind of, you can introduce kind of conceptual complexity by about the materialization of things, but also have some kind of clarity and simplicity, so that the reader doesn't get lost. I want that if you see a page that I've made in this book, or in any book now, that you know how to approach it, and that you're not looking at someone being creative. And that goes back to, of course, to the I swear I use no art at all kind of statement.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But am I looking at something that is, in your perception, ambiguous, or am I looking at something that is completely straightforward?
I think it's both. I think that's ambiguous about it. And that you play with the opacity of the paper, that you see this kind of transparency, that you also play with kind of the size of the book and the weight, because it's on a very bulky paper, so it's much lighter than you would expect if you would pick it up. Those kind of perceptions I play with.
Yeah, so you also play with the element of confusion.
Yeah.
To distort maybe impressions that we might have from past experiences, or other books that we've seen, or other theories that we've read about. Yeah.
And that's always been the starting point for my work, that I understand that this is not the first book that you pick up or the first map that you see. And you bring this kind of experiences with you, and I have to do with it something with that as a designer.
Do we have to be an avid reader of Joost Grootens' oeuvre to be able to fully grasp what is there in this dissertation?
There's many layers there, but I don't think anyone will completely get it. And I don't care. I don't think I think you sense it. I think it's that kind of it's a texture that you feel. And I know this right. So
it made me wonder about the difference in written language and in visualized language. That if any sentence in your essays would have been debatable, we would have talked about that.
Yeah.
And not for just a minute, but maybe for 2 hours.
Yeah.
Could the same be true for your visualizations?
Yes, I think so.
And about a line or a different shade of a color or whatever.
Yeah.
In much the same way?
Yeah. I think now the book has 192 pages, so it has probably around 40 to 50 kind of visualizations in it. I think in total we made more than 300 to 400 of them. So it was, we made just by making many of them and then making different versions of it. And there's another conversation. It's a conversation that's happening in the studio. It's the conversation that we have as a kind of team here. And it was also, for me, these visualizations are not the kind of the visualization as an illustration of a finding, but they were kind of a way to find out things. And if you put things on paper and something visually starts to appear, then maybe something conceptually is also happening there. So it was also making different iterations was also and just seeing what happened was also to do it. And then so there are different way. We want to make them also into a series, so that we want to do so. There's a certain kind of a horizontal direction always means development in time. A vertical direction always has to do with proximity, with distance, being further away, being closer. There is a certain pink hue that is always about a kind of something that you've seen before in black, and then you see returns. There are certain echoes kind of in the visualizations of something that you see in one case study that kind of echoes with another one, but then a different scale. So it was a very conscious series.
Yeah. So like you researched the legend of Google Maps.
Yeah.
We could make a legend out of your book if we look closely enough.
Yeah. Yeah, if you do it the same way, you could find it. But I think it's kind of these kind of very straightforward, simple things. I think that I don't want to surprise the reader that they think of, if they see a new visualization, what am I looking at? They should just bring that kind of that experience that they have, and then because I see them as a kind of argumentation. Visualization, they form a kind of argumentation, and therefore I have to use a similar kind of grammar. If we go back to language, so I should be kind of consistent there in how I approach it, in order for it to work as a kind of argumentation.